I'll speak very briefly. My position is, my identity is maybe a little different in the sense that I am a devotee of Sri Aurobindo and the mother, and also I am teaching in Delhi University in the psychology department, and not just teaching psychology because I don't teach much of Western psychology, only from a historical perspective. My entire focus now is on Indian psychology and the contribution of Indian thought to psychology. And my inspiration comes from Sri Aurobindo's writings. And we've managed over the last 10 years to bring in a significant component of Indian psychology and culminating in the integral psychology of Sri Aurobindo. Now, so when I comment from that vantage point as a person who derives his inspiration from Sri Aurobindo and the mother, but functioning in an institution, in an academic institution. I'll begin by commenting briefly on history centrism. What came to my mind is that in general, the thesis appeals to me. I first read it some 7-8 years back. Rajiv ji had written a paper on this particular thing. And at that time also, in some sense, I would agree with Vladimir about the wider perspective on history, but specifically, I see each avatar as activating a new level of consciousness, making it available for all of humanity. And so in that sense, there is history. But once that gets activated, so if the supramental consciousness becomes available after 1956, it is available to everybody and we can access it. And if we forgot about Sri Aurobindo, it wouldn't really be a problem because we would still have the benefits of the supramental consciousness. So in a more detailed analysis, perhaps it is not history centrism in that sense, but there is history. History is important in terms of the evolution of consciousness in the way Sri Aurobindo has also explained it. I see a positive contribution of the book in the academia because my biggest challenge is that how to get the students, the young minds to read and reflect on these ideas, and it usually doesn't work if I give them Sri Aurobindo's original writings, even excerpts or chapters. They are not able to relate to it, partly because of language, partly because of the abstraction which is needed and the experience behind it. So in that case, a book of this kind does, for example, integral unity, this idea of that oneness, which is a very dominant theme in Indian thought right from the Vedic times. Or Kabir Das ji says that the well is one, but people go to the well to take the water. Sorry, the water is one, but the container that you use to pick up the water is different, but the water inside is the same. So all of us, these vessels are different, but the consciousness, pani sab mein ek, water is one. That is again an expression of that integral unity. And so with the students, I find that this kind of a thing, it's very readable, it's very contemporary. And because there is this overexposure to the West, mostly United States, they understand that context and they are often taken up by some superficial things, and the deeper issues they are not able to reflect on. Also, they know somewhere that they are not accepted by them, that them meaning the dominant group there. So there again I find that it takes up these ideas and sort of makes it very easy for them to differentiate. I mean, not easy, but it makes it possible for them to see where the differences lie. And also why possibly the dharmic view can lead to greater harmony. Whereas if you take a Abrahamic view, there are these, the word you use there, irreconcilable differences. We differ and eventually one may have to kill the other. So this actually could be very, very, and this is very significant. So as an introduction to spiritual psychology from the vantage point of integral unity, as an introduction to what Hinduism is all about. Sri Aurobindo used the term Sanatan Dharma, and there again he refers to that. It's the same idea, I think, when you talk about integral unity. So for the younger person, that works very well. And simultaneously, I think at a larger level, not just the students, but Indians around the world and other people who are open to this different way, possibly a way which can solve many of the significant problems of the world. This resurgence of India, one is the economic thing. Everybody is taking India more seriously. But what about intellectually and more so spiritually? There's a limit to what you can get through these yoga institutes. You're just touching the surface. But when ideas go around through this and in a very academic fashion with the spirit of debate behind it, Purv Paksha as you put it, I think it is probably very useful in the academic setting, because then one can take it up. Last thing that I would like to mention is more of a request to Rajiv, maybe he'll throw the ball back in my court. But in India, since many of us are interacting with Muslims, and I myself like to debate with some of the Muslim academics in Delhi in psychology, if we could have some writing, maybe as a chapter or as an appendix, or not necessarily even added to the book, where instead of Christianity you take up Islam. I think for Indians, for many Indians at least, that would be useful for this dialogue, because I've been engaging in that kind of a dialogue. Right. Thank you.
I was thinking quite a bit about this book, and when I read it, I had many thoughts. And I think it is like, in a nutshell, the whole project. It's the beginning of looking at things differently. I was also very inspired by the change which is already felt in the book. Before we were a little bit afraid that Rajiv is a little bit too pushy or wants to create another tiger which will eat this tiger. But his clarification at the end of tiger and deer was very useful. We have to remain a deer, but we have to also develop certain strategies, a certain understanding how to remain a deer, not to be eaten by the tiger. And many people are afraid of this movement because of that there can be another tiger, yes, which will become again very critical. And when you deal with a tiger of this kind, you become tiger-like deer. And in that sense, there is a resistance towards this thought. They call it fundamentalism, religious fundamentalism, and so on and so forth. It is very well used. But if you read deeper into the spirit of the book, you will find something else, something much more subtle, much more suggestive, and much more integral, as he puts it, than that other type of unity, which he calls synthetic. I would call it analytic unity. Synthetic word is used by Sri Aurobindo a bit differently. That was little not comfortable, but otherwise I understand the thought. So if we call that synthetic unity, is fine. But what you mean is analytic unity, where things are kept as they are, these parts of the aggregate. They are never becoming one anyhow, and there is always a fear of chaos, as you rightly put it, because of that very nature. But what I liked most in this book is that Rajiv is moving away from the content of religions and goes straight into the character, distinction in character, not in the content, because Christian mystics had also revelations and had received higher, and also Hindu saints and sages and rishis are speaking about the higher revelation from above. It's not necessarily only that they are moving from below up, but there is one interesting characteristic which I noticed, that in revelations from above in the religions of dharmic character, we have always the quest from within. And this quest from within is answered from above. And that's why it becomes that embodied knowledge, as he puts it. Embodied knowledge because there is always a quest. In the religions of the West or the Abrahamic religions, it is not very obvious, that quest from within. In Augustine's case, it is obvious. He had this quest, and that's why he is unique. He speaks about meditations. I read Augustine myself, and I liked him. He was very close to, for me, for Indian, so to say, practice of meditation. How he was used and what happened afterwards is another matter. But religious practice of finding the truth, finding the God within yourself was there, and it is still there in the mystics. There are other mystic traditions which are not obvious, which are off the line, major stream of religion. The other thing what I like, and I thought also to comment on it, historicentrism as against embodied knowledge of dharmic religions. And I thought, how come that history is not so prominent in the dharmic religions? And it is not totally so also, again. There is simply vaster history. And this vaster history is that what is usually referred as, we know it as Kali Yuga and all these yugas, cycles of the embodied, so to say, of the embodiment of the soul, of the group soul, not only of the individual soul. And here we have another perspective altogether of the history. It's no more related to the historical event, but in certain religions like Buddhism or Jainism, it is still history related. And why? Because these are monotheistic religions. And it's quite interesting to bring this distinction of monotheistic religions, which are inspired by some teacher who got some revelation from above or from within, and claims that to be true. He establishes another norm. And that's why we had Buddhism with Ashoka, with his sword, running through all India down to the south, massacre, killing everyone in the name of the truth of Buddha. Then he repelled, he changed, he was converted into Buddhism. We know the story. But these movements were there also in India. These wars, religious wars, Shaiva and Vaishnava in the south, we know them. I studied history for 6 years in the university. So we saw these movements also there. They are part of that history-centric mentality. And that's why I like how he introduces this term. He doesn't touch religions and their content, but looks into the character, what happens to us on this level. So I think these monotheistic religions, and it is a question, most probably will be answered by research, are mainly history-related. What happened to Buddhism and Jainism, though they are history-related, they are still on the ground of something which is not history-related. And that something is the Veda. The Veda is the beginning of all spirituality, which deals with universals and not with individual consciousness. It deals with the universals which are applicable to any individual. That's why we can recognize our truths in those truths. And there were rishis who were, as Mother says, involutionary beings. Not even evolutionary, not like human beings. They are like avatars who brought the higher knowledge for the humanity to follow. So there is another view altogether on history centrism in India. It's simply a vaster view and more impersonal. It has no more personal relations with some Vamadeva or Vishwamitra. Vishwamitra appears in all the epics and Puranas and in all the stories. And actually it creates a completely different approach to life and reality in India. And I noticed that, Kalidasa wrote dozens of books, but there are so many books which are claimed to be his work, because all those who were writing those books, they wrote Kalidasa. They don't have any claim, personal claim, authorship or copyright claim for those books. They like to sign Kalidasa. But there are only few Kalidasa's books. So in a way, that is what is happening to India. It is a vaster view on history, an embodiment of the soul, an understanding of manifestation of the spirit, which we all represent. If we widen that perspective, we will see the place for these religions also within it, with their historic centristic approach. We will put them there. That's why Indians are never fighting against them. And that's what you mentioned in your book. Because the Dharmic approach, or the approach of embodied knowledge, has always had respect to any way of finding the truth. Even this way, even this narrow way. Of course, until it becomes dangerous and wants to eat you alive and leave nothing of you. But otherwise it is accepted. That's why Christianity was accepted in India. Islam was accepted in India, though they came with the sword and so on. The other thing is interesting about monotheistic religions is that it is narrowing historicentrism, so to say. It becomes historical event-related issue. And also, all monotheistic religions introduce linear time perception. It's also an interesting observation. That linear time perception is a property of the mental structure, in Gebserian terms. So it will be always linear related. There will be events from that major event. All other events are related to this major event, the source event, the origin. Yeah? The origin is shifted away from some real origin. Yes. So that's basically all the points which I made for the second chapter, which was very inspiring, and I read it several times, looking deeper into the possibility of development of this kind of thinking, and also embracing those religions, so to say, becoming the deer tiger, which will take it in and make out of that tiger, which is always hungry, some kind of different kind of tiger, which will become part of the whole picture as it is viewed in Dharmic religions. Thank you.
First of all, it's a good idea of introducing something on Islam, but I'm not sure if Rajiv ji will be, allowed entry after that into India. So you should be a little careful about it, And the second thought, which, because it's just immediate, is that while it is true that supramental is there and we can access it, I'm not sure whether we can do away with Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. Sri Aurobindo and the Mother themselves spoke about it. There is always, it's far more easier for human mind or human consciousness, as it is so constituted, to delve upon and to approach that truth through a personality. It has its own charm, it has its own beauty, its own delight. And as long as we don't quarrel between Rama and Krishna, it's perfectly fine and a valid approach. And I think even an easier approach, because that's what is captured in the concept of Inishta Devta. So if we do away with that aspect, which often we tend to do it in a hurry, that the consciousness is there, we don't need to, the human being has become in the background or redundant, I think it can be a great error, because there is a need in human heart for the Ishta Devta. And Rama, Krishna, Christ, Muhammad, Guru Nanak and Sri Aurobindo, they all answer to this need in the human consciousness. So they must very much be there, and perhaps it's an easier way. Just a few quick reactions to some of the issues. This analogy of the tiger and the porcupine is very interesting. But I rather appreciate also the idea of Vladimir of the tiger deer. So it's quite possible, it's very similar to what Sri Ramakrishna says, that the snake should not bite, but you can hiss. So it's good sometimes to have the heart of very difficult to say whether you should have the heart of a lion and the appearance of a deer, or either ways. But the thing is that it's sometimes important to defend. And when you defend a certain culture, being different is kind of part of that. When I defend an onslaught on a culture with which I'm in deeper sympathy with, I don't say that I'm born into it,
that may or may not be relevant, then I think it's very valid. It's not same as fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is when I go about converting others into my own cultural type, and that is definitely bad. It's, I would say, an evil thing to do, because it takes away human liberty. We have a right to be free and decide for ourselves. But equally, if a certain culture is attacked, it has absolute right to not only defend but defend aggressively. So I feel there's nothing wrong in that, and that's where I feel it's important also that in the book a bit of cultural sensitivity, which I think is lacking, especially in the Western Eastern concept, that there is a lack of certain cultural sensitivity, which, like, we have tantra parlors, and we have Buddha fashion bars, and I don't watch them, please, but I'm aware of it, so don't draw conclusions and inferences. Or we have recently Ganesha on the sandals, or the debate about M.F. Hussain painting Durga nude. I feel it's a sign of depravity. It's a sign of lack of cultural sensitivity. And I suppose it's important to understand that why these images, these thoughts, these legends, these myths have evolved in a certain context. Because then we can be more sensitive, more sympathetic to what they really represent. I may not believe in them, it's fine, there's no issue about it. But I must understand their full context. So there is a need for cultural sensitivity, which is very, very important, and probably a book in the offing out of your many books which sensitizes people to the true sense of Indian culture. And when I say culture, I am not just talking of Brahman as one, that is one part of the culture. A lot of things in India derive from that, but how they derive, for instance, as a child when I woke up, I touched Mother Earth and I did pranam to Surya in the morning. I mean, this was ingrained in the Indian culture. The first thing getting down off my bed, I must touch Mother Earth, and then I must do pranam to sun, and then I must touch my parents' feet, and then the first roti, which is made chapati, should be given to the cow and the dog. Now, this is a very simple thing. When I do a namaskar, there is a meaning behind it. When I bow down before a deity, I'm not just doing some obscure rituals. Why I'm saying this is because very often when we take that stand that Brahman is one, then we think all the rest we can do away with. And there are, we have instances where we wash the baby away with the bath water. There are people within the ashram context that if you go to the ashram and bow down at the samadhi, it is regarded as you are being obscurantist. We need to understand the need for even surrender at the most physical level. So this is very important. I also feel that Indian thought there are two ways of unity. One, of course, Rajiv ji has rightly brought out, you devour and finish. Now this is a dangerous way. This is no better than a tyrant who finishes all his opponents. But there is another way of unity where you take in and liberate. I always found it very interesting that when Krishna killed his opponents, the Rakshasas, the word used was uddhar, not vad. So he was not killing, he was liberating. So I think it's a great contribution that Indian light can liberate the spirit in different religion, and I think that could be another chapter where how different religions are approaching that one. And they are lost now in the rituals or just the externalities. But if you go to the spirit, it would be very interesting. I think people have touched upon that. There is a third thing which I feel, that between tiger, deer, tiger, porcupine, tiger, elephant can walk, not bothered about the tiger. There can be another approach, tiger, man. Man is qualitatively a very different thing altogether. So liberate the truths in religion, turn them into their true spiritual insight. It will solve the quarrel. This has been touched by many other. And then few other things. So the other is about the U-turn. Now I feel it has its both sides. Very seriously I've given a thought to it. It's, for instance, now we have the past life regression therapy. Now, past life is typically concept which has evolved in the Indian subcontinent, but it has been taken by certain people in the West, and they are using it in their own way. Not that I'm a great fan of it. I know there are many mixed elements in it. But in the process, certain key ideas get slipped into an ethos which would otherwise not accept it. So it's not that U-turn is necessarily all bad, even where it's done by certain, certain vested interest, it serves a certain purpose in the great economy of, world march. So the idea of, I think, past life has come into the Western world thanks to these kind of approaches, which maybe as an Indian I would feel it's too childish. But at the same time it has been accepted, and today if we go into New Age religion, it is defined. One of the things is that belief in past life and karma. So it's very interesting that this can be also used in its own way. So while it's important to put things in the right perspective, when things take a U-turn, it's also important to pick up certain things which are happening in the other side of the world and give them a very Indian touch. Lift them to their newer idea. To give this example about past life regression, when people ask me about past life regression, I can get into a debate and say, well, the original idea is very Indian and it has been taken up by some Western people and they have misused it. But on the other hand, I can say, well, my issue about past life regression is that all memories, when you go back, do not necessarily relate to the soul memory. Now, without actually talking about Indian and Western context, I am bringing in a truth which is very much Indian and taking that whole movement one step further. And the same thing can be done with Wilbur, which I completely agree is totally and thoroughly imitation, and I would rather use much more strong words. I was very shocked and surprised when I read Wilbur talking about Aurobindo as being on stage 3, whereas there's Wilbur 5 and stuff like that, which is pure intellectual stuff with no iota of experience in it. And this happens partly because often there is a feeling that much that Aurobindo has written, or let's say mystics have written, is an intellectual philosophy. It is not. It is born out of experience. So it's very important when one goes to a person who is intellectually taking an idea, assimilating and putting it forth. If I were the one to challenge him, I would ask him, do you have the experience? I mean, it's all right to speak of Brahman as one, but I would rather like to ask him, do you have the experience? If not, just leave the place. It doesn't make any sense. Whatever you may be writing, it may be very high philosophy, but it doesn't make sense at all. So this aspect of Indian thought should also be brought out. Okay. So non-translatability of Sanskrit, I think that was a very important point which this Panditji touched, that we have to go into the spirit and bring out. If we take it that Sanskrit is completely non-translatable, then it will have issues and there would be problems. But it's important, like there are experiences, like when we use the word Ananda. How do I translate Ananda? It's one of those simple terms which is absolutely non-translatable, because first, it deals with the subjective domain. Second, it deals with a kind of experience. A lot of people misuse the term to mean many things. So there has to be found a way that these terms can be either brought out into other languages, and there is a lot of work required in that area. I think these are just some of the issues which I want to put forth, and I have a phone call which is indicating that I should just give the dais to someone else.
Okay, first I want to congratulate Rajiv on a very important and original and thought-provoking book. I think it's important because the book brings out the great qualities of Indian civilization, which is important especially for Indians, so that they can become proud and hold on to their important values and concepts, and not kind of toss them overboard in favor of an imitation of the West. And I think it's original because many of these distinctive qualities that he brings out, such as the ahistoric nature of its religion and spirituality, its integral unity, which embraces both diversity and unity, its comfort with diversity and chaos, and its many unique concepts that are part of its religion and spirituality embedded in its ancient Sanskrit language. These kind of distinctive qualities have not been, I think, brought out so clearly and descriptively as Rajiv has done. And it's thought-provoking because it challenges many currently held ideas and assumptions, especially of Westerners, but also of Westernized Indians. And what I want to talk about mainly is kind of my unique kind of Western perspective on this book, and a little bit of my story to kind of put that into context. I come from the US and had a thoroughly Western upbringing and education. But quite early on, when I was just 19 years old, I had already become fascinated by India and Indian spiritual thought in particular. And I had already rejected my Catholic religion, finding in its concepts nothing that I could really hold on to, nothing that really made sense for me or that answered my basic questions in life. In addition, I was growing up in the 60s and 70s and during the Vietnam War, and I also rejected, along with many of my contemporaries of that time, the kind of dominating, aggressive American political and economic policies and values. Indian spiritual thought was beginning to enter into the counterculture of that time. Books were available at the local spiritual bookshop. There were books on Sri Aurobindo and on many other Indian spiritual teachers, Vivekananda, Ramakrishna, and many others. And then at the same time, there were many Westerners that were beginning to take up Indian spirituality, Indian yoga, and begin to popularize them among the youth of the country. I came into contact with Sri Aurobindo's thought just before my 20th birthday, while enrolled in the South Asian Studies program at the University of Wisconsin. And though it wasn't through the program itself that I came into contact, but through my Indian roommate. And immediately I was struck by Sri Aurobindo's teaching and gave up, actually dropped my studies, which I would agree with Rajiv on the South Asian Studies program in the US was quite superficial and really didn't get at the deeper thought of India. From that moment, I recognized that Sri Aurobindo held a great truth, and I dedicated myself to trying to live that out to the best of my ability, and I don't think I've ever wavered from that goal. After a few years of reading and practice on my own, I went to a small Sri Aurobindo ashram and community in the US in upstate New York that had just a handful of members. And although I stayed for less than a year, I came into contact with the community of disciples and devotees of Sri Aurobindo in the US and never lost contact with them or with that center. And afterwards, I went back to school, finished my college and went to grad school, and then had a short career in academic psychology in the United States. After that, I dropped that again and went back to another Sri Aurobindo ashram in California, where I lived for a few years. It took me 28 years after coming into contact with Sri Aurobindo's thought that I finally came to India to live. I had never been particularly drawn to coming to India to live and was quite content to practice Sri Aurobindo's yoga in the US. However, I feel that Sri Aurobindo wanted me here and in fact had a kind of a dream experience in which he literally carried me here and brought me here. Close to the ashram. And I came here to Zakir to work on this online university that Ananda was developing, which was a perfect fit, I thought, for my academic skills and my spiritual interests. And after about a year, of living here, I met and got married to a local Tamil lady that was living here, so I experienced Indian culture very close up. She is not an Aurobindonian and is very steeped in her traditional spirituality and religion, which I respect but do not myself embrace, and we're able to kind of respect each other's spiritual paths and not interfere with them. Now, how does this relate to the book? I think, first of all, it suggests that not all Westerners and not all Americans are cut of the same cloth. There is a wide diversity of people within the United States, many people that revere Indian spiritual thought. And for those, many people may not find their answers in Indian spiritual thought, but at the same time reject many of the kind of authoritarian, aggressive, dominating kind of qualities of Western or American politics and economics. Sometimes I felt that the book identifies the West with its worst qualities. This is not to say that there are not negative qualities and aggressive qualities against India that should be combated, but not all of the West is like that. Secondly, it suggests that all Westerners don't subscribe to Christian thought or values, and especially the most conservative and rigid ones. Among Christians, as well as I think in all religions, people run along a continuum from fundamentalists to eclectic pluralists to those who are emphasizing the spiritual elements to secularists. People run a wide gamut, and they're not all of one type. My mother was probably a typical Catholic, but she's faithful but not fanatical, and she never interfered in any way with my own spiritual path or my choice about it, and never really complained about it. I would even just mention my first wife's family was a kind of first generation Italian Americans. Her parents were born in the US, but her grandparents were not, were born in Italy. They were quite strictly Catholic. Her mother was somebody who went to church not just once a week, but every day. And they had, and their extended family, some of her aunts were also deeply religious. All of them, in my wife's family, there were, of the 5 children, 3 devotees, disciples of Sri Aurobindo and Mother. All of them had come to the ashram at one point or another. One of them stayed in the ashram for 7 years. My wife, my first wife, had come, met Mother, had her personal darshan. So they were a family that was deeply, touched by Sri Aurobindo and Mother, Indian spirituality. They kept, even though, Catholic, they always had a calendar from the ashram every year, a photo of Sri Aurobindo or Mother on their wall. And the parents very tolerant of this, no problem. And I just want to also say that it's not only India or other people in the East that are victimized by Christianity, but also people in the West are victimized by the church, including the victimization of child by the clergy in the Catholic Church, and as well by its conservative political and religious ideology. And I believe that most Christians in the West recognize that there are flaws in Christianity and tend to emphasize the positive aspects of their religion, such as just the trying to be good and compassionate, and live a good quality life. And I don't think that they harp so much on the principles or the dogmas of the Christian religion. On the ground, I don't think that's as important as it might be among the theologians or among the clergy. Nevertheless, I think the book is important in revealing and warning against organized religions' tactics of converting Hindus to Christian dogma. And thirdly, I think that my story suggests that the infiltration of Indian thought into American culture, and even when it's assimilated into new forms of expression, can be a good thing for India, for the West, and for the world as a whole. And Rajiv speaks about the digestion of Indian culture, but it seems to me that when an individual or a society emulates the positive qualities of another individual or another society, that does not in itself destroy or take away from that emulated culture. Okay? The spiritual thought of India is permanently inscribed in the spiritual scriptures of India and in the hearts and the souls of hundreds of millions of Indians. And whatever America or the West does, it cannot take that away. I think it's only that if Indians themselves relinquish their traditions, their values, their own spirituality in favor of the West, that there is a danger of losing this culture. So Indians must become confident and secure in their own values and traditions, and then they will be safe from Western influence. And I think that this book is very important in contributing to highlighting India's positive contributions in building this confidence in Indians. And finally, I would like to say a word about the Sanskrit non-translatables, which I think would perhaps better be termed as mistranslatable. I mean, all concepts can be mistranslated. Sri Aurobindo presented his metaphysics and his yoga, which were based on Vedic and Sanskrit principles and concepts, in English. This enabled me, a teenager living in Wisconsin, as well as all of you, to read and understand them. I believe he translated them quite well. I think we must consider the reality on the ground and accept that the English language and the modern languages need to be used in order to express India's ancient spiritual thought. And this is not to say that we should throw Sanskrit out or India's ancient scriptures, but it suggests that they can indeed be translated. Now, these translations are not always one word for another word. Sometimes you need to explain a word such as Brahmin or whatever. I mean, and even if you can translate, or if you don't translate, say a word like yoga, I mean, it can still be mistranslated. Even though they use the word yoga, it becomes physical exercise or something. So not translating it isn't always the safest or the best policy either. It doesn't prevent the problem. But what needs to be done is that these concepts need to be explained more fully. And I think part of Sri Aurobindo's work, an important part of his work, was indeed to translate the ancient Sanskrit concepts into contemporary language. So that's.
In 1938, when Anil Baran Roy, he prepared a translation of the Gita, taking words of Sri Aurobindo from essays on the Gita and presented it to Sri Aurobindo. And then he asked, can it go as your translation? Answer was no. Sri Aurobindo never intended to translate anything. In fact, he said, translating Sanskrit into any European language is an impossibility. At the same time, the proposal that to keep the Sanskrit words as it is in English is also not the solution. I find a problem from both sides. Either to translate Sanskrit from Sanskrit to any European language, or from any European language or from English to Sanskrit. I'll give you some examples. I was trying to find something like what could be the translation, how do we say Ramakrishna Paramahansa, and then I found a lot of European scholars, they have put Paramahansa as Ramakrishna the Great Swan. Same way, I found Chhatrapati Shivaji is presented as Shivaji the Lord of Umbrella. Right. If this is so ridiculous, at the same time I also find when the phrase dead language is translated into Sanskrit as Mrita Bhasha, it also sounds ridiculous to me. Because dead language cannot be Mrita Bhasha. What could be the translation of the Mrita? Then I have examples like how do I translate my telephone is dead? Can I translate it as Mrita Duravani? When we have the phrase like dead capital, when I have phrase like even adverbially when it is used as he is walking dead slow, how do I translate it into Sanskrit? So there is a problem on both sides. So what could be the solution? Then the same way like I was trying to find some Sanskrit words when like what could be the translation of the word free? When you say free education, this entrance is free. Now I have no free time. But throughout in India you find free is translated as mukta. But when I say like I have no free time, I am not a free man. So how do I translate it? And saying that ahamna mukta manushya is ridiculous. But the same way, like when Sanskrit words are translated into like Paramahansa becomes the great swan and Chhatrapati becomes Lord of Umbrella. And if this happens at this level, when think of the rich spiritual experiences of the Vedic rishis, so how do we translate them? But at the same time you cannot leave them untranslated. That also will lead to some other kind of distortion. So the solution what Sri Aurobindo provides that we need a new science of language. And that new science of language is based on the root sounds and the fundamental experiences behind the root sounds. We need to identify the root sounds of each word and the fundamental experiences behind the root sounds, not only the root sounds, the root words, even the seed sounds from which the root sounds are formed. Otherwise it's very difficult to translate. How to translate the word Shraddha, Sankalpa, Tapasya, and you cannot yet let them go like that. So the proposal which is given by Sri Aurobindo, let's reconstruct or think of a new science of language based on root sounds and the fundamental experiences is the only solution to interpret the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Gita, or all that has been treasured in the Sanatan Dharma. Thank you.